The station called Helianthus Prime was the most beautiful thing ever built by living hands, and it floated in the golden light of a sacred star, like a jewel hanging in the void of space. For 900 years, this place had been the heart of galactic peace, a monument to the promise that war would never return, that the horrors of the ancient epoch wars were buried forever in the past, and that every species in the galaxy could live without fear. 12 species had signed the Luminara Pact here, and every 50 years they gathered again to reaffirm that promise in a grand ceremony that drew thousands of diplomats, scholars, artists, and civilians from every corner of known space. Today was that day. Ambassador Lyra Osei stood near the edge of the observation gallery and looked out at the arriving ships with quiet pride in her dark eyes. She was humanity's representative to the Concord of 12, and even after 3 years in the role, she still felt the weight of it every single day. Humanity was the youngest species in the Concord, barely 200 years spacefaring, and admitted only as a provisional member, which was a polite way of saying that nobody really took them seriously. The elder species were kind about it, mostly. They smiled at humans, the way a grandparent smiles at a toddler who has just learned to walk. And they said things like, "How charming," and "What potential," while making it very clear that the real decisions were made by the grown-ups. Lyra did not let it bother her, because she believed in the Concord, and she believed that one day her people would earn their place at the table. Behind her stood Sergeant Dara Mwangi of the Terran Marine Corps, tall and calm and watchful, with the kind of stillness that only comes from years of training for violence that never arrives. Dara was part of the small security detail assigned to the human delegation, and most of the alien diplomats found the very idea of a military escort to be slightly embarrassing, like bringing a sword to a poetry reading. But Dara did not care what they thought, because her job was to keep the ambassador alive, and she intended to do exactly that. The ceremony began in the Grand Dome, transparent sphere, at the center of Helianthus Prime, where the leaders of all 12 species gathered on elevated platforms arranged in a perfect circle. The Velithari representative, an ancient and regal figure draped in robes of liquid silver, stood at the highest platform, as was tradition. The Velithari were the oldest species in the Concord, and they had always claimed the position of honor. Lyra watched as each species spoke their words of reaffirmation, beautiful speeches about unity and cooperation and the eternal promise of peace, and she felt a warmth in her chest that made her believe everything would be fine. She was wrong. It happened without warning. One moment the dome was filled with light and music and 10,000 voices speaking words of hope, and the next moment the sky above them split open with a sound that Lyra would never be able to describe to anyone who was not there. A ship appeared in orbit, massive and dark and shaped like a blade, uncloaking from nothingness, as if the universe itself had opened a wound. It was a Velithari warship, and its name was the Throne of Silence, and it had been hiding in the shadow of the sacred star for weeks. Before a single alarm could sound, before a single voice could cry out in confusion, the ship fired. A beam of white-hot energy, a weapon so powerful that it had not been seen in the galaxy for 900 years, lanced down from orbit and struck the Grand Dome with the force of a dying star. The world became fire. Lyra felt herself thrown through the air like a leaf in a hurricane, and she saw the dome shatter into 1,000,000 pieces of crystal that flew in every direction like glittering knives, and she heard screaming, so much screaming from so many different kinds of throats, and then something heavy and warm slammed into her from the side and drove her to the ground. It was Dara. The sergeant had moved before her conscious mind had even understood what was happening, throwing her own body over the ambassador. Activating a personal kinetic barrier, a small emergency device meant for one person, and stretching it over both of them, as the world above turned to fire and ruin. The barrier held, barely, and they lay there in the dark while the station burned around them. When the fire finally died, and the emergency system sealed the breaches and the dust began to settle, Lyra pushed herself up and looked at the place where the Grand Dome had been. It was gone. Where 10,000 beings had stood moments ago, there was now only twisted metal and shattered glass. Over 4,000 diplomats from 9 different species were dead, including the leaders of 6 of the 12 Concord nations, vaporized in a single instant by a single shot from a single ship. Lyra could not breathe. Dara pulled her to her feet and held her steady, and Lyra saw that the sergeant was bleeding from a dozen cuts where the barrier had not quite been enough. But Dara's eyes were clear and hard, and focused in a way that Lyra had never seen before. "We need to move, Ambassador," Dara said, and her voice was steady as stone. Around them, the surviving aliens were not moving at all. They stood, or sat, or lay on the ground, in states of shock so deep that they could not even process what had happened, because nothing like this had happened in 900 years, and their minds simply did not have a place to put it. And then the broadcast came. Every screen, every communication device, every speaker on every ship and station in the galaxy came alive at the same time, with the face of Emperor Calith Jur of the Velathari, ancient and terrible, and smiling with a cruelty that Lyra felt in her bones. "The age of equals is over," he said, and his voice was calm and cold and certain. "The Velathari will no longer pretend that lesser species deserve a voice in the shaping of this galaxy. The pact is dissolved. The Concord is dead, and any species that does not kneel before the Empire will be made silent, permanently." The broadcast showed fleet after fleet after fleet of Velathari warships emerging from hidden shipyards across the galaxy. Thousands of vessels that had been built in secret over centuries, armed with weapons that no one had thought existed anymore. The Velathari had been planning this for a very, very long time. Lyra stood in the ruins of the greatest monument to peace the galaxy had ever known, and watched the Emperor's face disappear from the screen. And she felt something cold settle into her stomach. Not fear exactly, but the terrible understanding that the world she had believed in was gone, and would never come back. Around her, the alien survivors began to weep in ways unique to their species. The Quillith chittered in low, broken frequencies. The Rathani dimmed their crystalline bodies until they were almost dark. Torvani simply went silent, in a way that was worse than any scream. None of them knew what to do, because none of them had ever needed to know what to do when someone tried to kill them all. But Dara knew. The sergeant looked at the burning sky, and the shattered station, and the weeping aliens, and the distant shapes of warships moving against the stars, and something ancient and human stirred in her chest. Something that her species had carried for 10,000 years through every war and every disaster and every moment when the world ended and they had to build it again. "Ambassador," Dara said quietly, "we need to contact Earth." Lyra looked at her, and in that moment she understood what Dara already knew, that in a galaxy full of species that had forgotten what violence was, there was only one species that still remembered. Only one species that had kept its soldiers and its weapons and its terrible precious knowledge of how to fight. Species was the smallest, youngest, most overlooked civilization in the entire Concord. Humanity. 900 years of peace had ended with a single shot, and the galaxy had no idea what to do about it. But the humans did, because humanity had never truly believed that peace would last forever, and that sad, stubborn, beautiful skepticism was about to become the most valuable thing in the universe. The galaxy was falling apart, and it was falling apart fast. In the 3 days since the attack on Helianthus Prime, The Vilathari Empire had moved with a speed and precision that proved just how long they had been planning this moment. Their hidden fleets poured out of secret shipyards like a river breaking through a dam, and system after system received the same simple message: surrender or be destroyed. Most of them surrendered. The Torvani homeworld fell first. The Torvani were a gentle, philosophical species known for their poetry and their deep connection to the natural world. And when the Vilathari fleet appeared in their sky and demanded submission, the Torvani government opened communication channels and tried to reason with them. The Vilathari responded by bombing their largest city from orbit. After that, the Torvani surrendered, and a shockwave of terror spread across the galaxy, as every species realized that this was not a negotiation. This was a conquest, and the conquerors were not interested in talking. The Quillith hive worlds went next. The insectoid species tried to scatter their population across multiple systems, but the Vilathari simply blockaded every jump point and starved them into compliance within 48 hours. The Rathani retreated to their crystal caves and sealed themselves inside, hoping that if they hid deep enough, the Empire would leave them alone. It did not work. On every world, the reaction was the same: confusion, panic, and a desperate, helpless paralysis that came from 900 years of never needing to think about violence. The alien species did not have militaries. They did not have weapons. They did not have soldiers or generals or war plans or strategic doctrine. Their shipyards built cargo vessels and science platforms and luxury transports. Their greatest engineers designed water purification systems and atmospheric processors and communication networks. They had spent almost a millennium perfecting the arts of peace, and now peace was gone, and they had absolutely nothing to replace it with. On a damaged medical frigate drifting through the outer systems, Ambassador Lyra Osei lay in a recovery pod, with burns covering 30% of her body, and a piece of station shrapnel still lodged in her left shoulder. The alien doctors had stabilized her, but they looked at her with eyes full of something she had never seen from the elder species before. Not pity, not condescension, but need. "What do we do?" a Quillith physician asked her, and Lyra realized with a shock that this brilliant ancient being, a member of a species that had been traveling between stars when humanity was still living in caves, was genuinely asking a human for help. Lyra closed her eyes and thought about everything she knew, and then she opened a secure channel to Earth. "Get me anyone with stars on their shoulders," she said. 6,000 light-years away, on the human colony world of New Tangier, a 70-year-old man named Jonah Achebe was sitting in his garden and reading a book about the Battle of Canny when his communication terminal began screaming at him. Admiral Achebe, retired, had spent 40 years in the Terran Defense Force before stepping down to teach military history at the Colonial University. He was a tall man with gray hair and kind eyes, and hands that were more comfortable holding a book than a weapon. But those hands had once commanded the largest human fleet ever assembled during a border dispute that the elder species had resolved with a polite conversation before any shots were fired. The elder species had always found the Terran Defense Force to be slightly ridiculous, a military without a war, soldiers without an enemy, an entire institutional structure built around a threat that the galaxy had collectively agreed did not exist. How quaint, the alien diplomats would say when they visited human space and saw the patrol frigates and the marine barracks and the war colleges. How very human. Jonah had never argued with them, but he had also never agreed. There was a saying in the Achebe family that went back generations. The fence does not stop the lion, but it tells the lion you are ready. And Jonah had always believed that readiness was its own kind of wisdom. Now, as he read the emergency briefings that poured into his terminal like water from a broken pipe, he understood that his entire life had been preparation for this moment. The situation was worse than bad. It was catastrophic. The Velathari had at least 12,000 capital ships, armed with weapons that could crack planets open like eggs. The Terran Defense Force had maybe 300 combat-capable vessels, most of them small patrol frigates designed to chase pirates, not fight a galactic empire. But Jonah saw something in the intelligence reports that gave him a strange, cold hope. The Velathari were powerful, but they were using their power like a hammer, smashing everything flat with overwhelming force and expecting submission. Their tactics were crude. Their formations were textbook patterns from 900 years ago, and their strategy was based entirely on the assumption that nobody would fight back. They had rebuilt the weapons of war, but they had forgotten the art of war. They knew how to destroy, but they did not know how to fight. Not really, not against an enemy that understood combat the way humans understood combat, with all its tricks and feints and sacrifices and terrible creative brilliance. Jonah Achebe had spent his entire career studying every war humanity had ever fought, from the ancient battles of Marathon and Thermopylae, to the trench warfare of the World Wars, to the orbital campaigns of the Unification era, and he carried all of that knowledge in his head like a library of fire. He contacted Ambassador Osei. "How many alien species are still free?" he asked. 7. Barely, she replied. "But they have nothing, Admiral. No weapons, no soldiers, no idea what to do. They are like children in a burning building." "Children in a burning building can still be led to the exit," Jonah said. "What do they have?" "Resources," Lyra said. "Industrial capacity that makes ours look like a toy factory. Technology centuries ahead of anything we have. Engineers and scientists who could build miracles if someone told them what to build. And they are desperate. Desperate enough to listen to anyone, even us." Jonah was quiet for a long time. "Tell them I will help," he said finally. "Tell them humanity will lead, but they will have to trust us, and they will have to do things that go against everything they have believed for 900 years. "What things?" Lyra asked. "They will have to learn how to fight." Within a week, representatives from 7 alien species gathered in a hidden station deep in the Kessler Void, a region of dead space where no trade routes ran and no sensors reached, and they sat across a table from a retired human admiral who was about to ask them to do the impossible. Jonah looked at them, the towering Rathani with their crystalline bodies, the Quileth with their compound eyes and clicking mandibles, the Torvani envoys who flinched at every loud noise, and he felt a wave of something that was equal parts compassion and determination. "I am not going to lie to you," he said. "The Velathari are stronger than all of us combined, and they have been planning this for centuries. We cannot beat them in a straight fight. Not yet, maybe not ever." The alien leaders shifted uncomfortably. "But I have studied war my entire life," Jonah continued, "and I can tell you this. Wars are not won by the strongest. They are won by the smartest, the most adaptable, and the most determined. You have technology and resources that the Velathari cannot match. What you lack is the knowledge of how to use those things as weapons." He paused and looked at each of them in turn. "My species has that knowledge. We have carried it for 10,000 years, through more wars than any of you can imagine, and we have never, not once, allowed ourselves to forget it. Some of you thought that was a flaw. Today it is your salvation." A Quilith hive speaker clicked its mandibles nervously. "You are asking us to become something we are not." "No," Jonah said firmly. "I am asking you to become something you forgot you could be. Not conquerors, not killers, but defenders. There is a difference, and it matters." He stood up and placed his hands flat on the table. "You forgot how to fight," he said quietly. "We never did, and we never will. Give me your ships, your factories, your engineers, and your trust, and I will give you back your freedom." The room was silent for a very long time, and then, one by one, the alien leaders nodded. The smallest, youngest, most insignificant species in the galaxy had just been given command of the largest military alliance in history. And the war to reclaim the stars was about to begin. The Marin Nebula was a cloud of purple and gold dust that stretched across 3 light-years of empty space. And deep inside its glowing heart, hidden from every sensor and every spy satellite in the galaxy, the Resistance was being born. Admiral Jonah Achebe had chosen this place for exactly that reason. It was invisible, unreachable, and so far from any major trade route that the Veilithari would never think to look here. And in the 6 weeks since the alliance had formed, it had transformed from an empty pocket of space into the busiest shipyard in galactic history. The work was extraordinary, and it was also completely insane. Alien engineers who had spent their entire careers designing irrigation systems and atmospheric processors were now learning how to build weapons, and the learning curve was unlike anything Jonah had ever seen. These beings were brilliant, genuinely, staggeringly brilliant, and once they understood a concept, they could improve upon it in ways that made human engineers weep with jealousy. A Rathani crystal smith who had never seen a weapon before in her life took the basic design for a human plasma cannon, studied it for 2 days, and then redesigned it to be 400% more powerful, 50% lighter, and capable of recharging from ambient starlight. A Quilleth Hive engineer looked at human shield technology and within a week had created a network defense grid that allowed an entire fleet to share a single, massive energy barrier. Something human scientists had theorized about for decades, but never achieved. The problem was not intelligence or skill. The problem was psychology. Commander Yuki Tanaka discovered this on her very first day of training alien combat crews. Tanaka was a small, fierce woman with short black hair and a voice that could cut through a hurricane. And she had been assigned the job of turning peaceful alien civilians into something resembling soldiers. It was, she told Achebe privately, like trying to teach poetry to a rock, except the rock was smarter than her and kept crying. The Rathani were the biggest challenge. They were enormous, crystalline beings, standing 3 meters tall, with bodies that could absorb and redirect energy in ways that made them natural weapons platforms. But they were also deeply, fundamentally pacifist in a way that went beyond culture into something almost biological. When Tanaka showed them combat simulations, they shut down. Their crystal bodies went dark and cold, and they simply stopped responding, retreating into a meditative state that was their species' equivalent of a panic attack. "This is not working," Tanaka told Achebe after the 3rd failed training session. "They understand the concepts, but they cannot bring themselves to act on them. The very idea of hurting another living being causes them physical pain." "Then do not ask them to hurt anyone," Achebe said. "Ask them to protect someone." Tanaka did not understand at first, but she went back to the Rathani training group, and she changed her approach entirely. Instead of showing them attack patterns and firing solutions, she showed them images of their own homeworld. The crystal caves where their children grew, the singing spires where their elders meditated, the gardens of living light that they tended with such care. "The Veilithari are coming for these places," Tanaka told them quietly. "They will shatter your caves and silence your spires and break every crystal garden into dust, and there will be no one to stop them, unless you stand between your home and the fire." She paused and looked at the tallest Rathani, a young one named Sorath, whose crystal body glowed with a soft blue light. "You are not destroying anything," Tanaka said. "You are standing between the people you love and the people who would hurt them. That is not violence. That is love with a spine." Something changed in Sorath's light. It shifted from blue to a deep, burning gold. And slowly, carefully, the young Rathani raised their arms and activated the combat systems that had been installed in their crystal frame. It was a small moment, but it changed everything. The Quilleth were a different challenge entirely, and a different kind of success. As a hive-minded species, they could coordinate thousands of individuals with a precision that no other species could match, and once Tanaka introduced them to the concept of fleet tactics, they took to it with a terrifying enthusiasm. A Quilleth swarm of 1,000 small ships could move as one, turning, accelerating, and attacking in perfect synchronization without any communication delay at all. And when Tanaka ran the first full combat simulation with a Quilleth fleet, the results were so devastating that Achebe watched the replay 3 times with his mouth open. "They are going to be our greatest weapon," he said quietly. Meanwhile, on the occupied worlds, Sergeant Dara Mwangi was fighting a very different kind of war. She had been dropped onto the Torvani homeworld with a team of 12 human special operations soldiers, and a mission that sounded simple but was anything but: build a resistance network among a population that had never resisted anything in their entire history. The Torvani were gentle, thoughtful beings who communicated through a combination of spoken language and bioluminescent patterns on their skin. And the idea of deliberately sabotaging something or hurting someone was so foreign to them that Dara had to start from the very beginning. She did not start with weapons or tactics. She started with stories. She gathered small groups of Torvani in hidden basements and dark forests, and she told them about human history, about people who had faced oppression and tyranny and impossible odds, and had chosen to resist, not because they were violent by nature, but because they loved their freedom more than they feared their enemy. She told them about people who hid others in their homes at great personal risk, and people who carried messages through enemy lines, and people who quietly, carefully, methodically dismantled the machinery of tyranny one small act at a time. "You do not have to pick up a weapon," Dara told them. "You just have to refuse to help them. Break what they need, hide what they want, and be where they do not expect you to be." The Torvani listened, and something stirred in them. Not anger exactly, but a quiet stubbornness that Dara recognized because she had seen it in humans 1,000 times before. They began to resist. Velathari supply convoys found their routes blocked by accidental landslides. Communication relays went dark because of equipment malfunctions that happened to occur at the worst possible times. And Velathari soldiers who patrolled the occupied cities began to notice that the Torvani were looking at them differently. Not with fear, but with a calm, steady defiance that was somehow more unsettling than any weapon. Back in the Marin Nebula, Ambassador Osei was fighting her own war, a war of diplomacy and politics and sheer exhausting willpower. Holding the alliance together was like holding water in her hands. Species that had never cooperated were now being asked to share their most precious resources and their deepest technologies. And the old rivalries and suspicions that the Luminara Pact had buried, not resolved, just buried, were rising to the surface like heat from a fire. The Rathani did not trust the Quilleth, because 700 years ago there had been a territorial dispute that had been settled by the Concord but never truly forgotten. The Torvani resented the fact that their homeworld had been sacrificed while others remained free. And almost everyone looked at the humans with a mixture of gratitude and suspicion. Grateful for the help, suspicious of the species that happened to be the only one with weapons. Osei handled it all with a patience that amazed even Achebe. "You are angry at each other," she told a room full of arguing alien leaders during one particularly bad meeting. "Good. Anger means you still care. But the Velathari did not ask what species you were before they fired that shot. They did not check if you were Rathani or Quilleth or Torvani or human. To them you are all the same. You are all beneath them. So you can either fight each other over old wounds, or you can stand together against the people who are making new ones." The arguing stopped, at least for that day. Weeks passed, and the Resistance fleet grew. Alien ships were retrofitted with weapons that blended technologies from half a dozen species, crewed by beings who had learned to fight from the only species that had never forgotten how. HFY stood on the observation deck of the command station and watched a mixed formation of Rathani crystal ships, Quillith swarm fighters, and human frigates execute a combat drill with a precision that would have seemed impossible just weeks ago. The Velithari still outnumbered them badly, and their fleet was built for war from the ground up, while the Resistance fleet was held together with desperate engineering and human stubbornness. But when Commander Tanaka came to stand beside him and asked if they were ready, HFY allowed himself a small, tired smile. "It is not enough," he said, "but it does not have to be. It just has to be more than they expect." And across the galaxy, on the bridge of his golden flagship, Emperor Calith Jur received a report that the humans were organizing some kind of military resistance, and he laughed. "The insects have hired the vermin to lead them," he said to his admirals. "How fitting. Let them play at war. When we are finished with the others, we will swat them last." He was wrong about many things, but he was most wrong about that. Admiral Jonah HFY stood in the dim blue light of the command center aboard the Resistance flagship, and studied the tactical display with eyes that had not seen proper sleep in 11 days. The display showed the Urani confluence, a point in space where 12 major hyperlane routes crossed each other like threads in a web. And whoever held this junction controlled the movement of ships and supplies across nearly a third of the galaxy. The Velithari held it now, with a fleet of 3,000 warships arranged in a formation that was textbook perfect and 900 years out of date. "They are using the Kalithar formation," HFY said quietly to Commander Tanaka, who stood at his side with dark circles under her eyes that matched his own. "Named after the Velithari admiral who invented it during the Epoch Wars, a layered defensive sphere with capital ships at the core and screening vessels on the outer ring." "Is that bad for us?" Tanaka asked. "It would be if we were fighting a 900-year-old war," HFY replied. "But we are not." The plan he had devised was the most complex military operation ever attempted in galactic history, and it depended on every species in the Alliance doing something that none of them had ever done before, fighting together as one. He opened a communication channel to every ship in the Resistance fleet. "This is Admiral HFY," he said, and his voice was calm and steady, even though his heart was beating so hard he could feel it in his throat. "In 3 hours, we are going to do something that has not been done in 900 years. We are going to fight a battle, and we are going to win it. Not because we are stronger than the Velithari, because we are not. Not because we have more ships, because we do not. But because we have something they lost a long time ago, the ability to adapt, to surprise, and to fight for something more important than power." He paused. "I know many of you did not choose this. I know that a month ago some of you did not even understand what war was. But you are here, and that means you have already done the bravest thing any living being can do. You have chosen to stand up when it would have been easier to kneel." He took a breath. "Today we fight not to conquer, but to prove that resistance is possible. The galaxy is watching, and what they see today will determine whether they find the courage to join us or the despair to surrender. So, let us give them something worth watching." The fleet moved. The first phase was the Quillith. 300 Quillith swarm ships, small, fast, and moving with the eerie synchronization of a single organism, burst out of the nebula and swept toward the Velithari outer screen like a cloud of angry insects. The Velithari sensors went wild, 300 individual contacts appearing simultaneously in perfect formation was something their tracking systems simply could not process efficiently, because the systems had been designed to track large capital ships, not swarms of tiny vessels moving as one. Velithari Admiral Sethkai Vorn watched the swarm approach and ordered her screening vessels to engage, and they did. pouring fire into the Quilith formation with enough energy to level a continent. But the Quilith did not fight like any enemy the Veilithari had ever trained for. They scattered and reformed, and scattered again, flowing around the enemy fire like water around stones. And every time the Veilithari gunners thought they had a lock, the swarm shifted into a new pattern, and the shots went wide. The swarm was not trying to destroy anything. It was trying to blind the Veilithari sensors, and it was working. Phase 2, HFY said. The Rithani crystal ships emerged from the nebula in a wedge formation. Enormous vessels crewed by beings of living crystal who had learned just weeks ago that their bodies could absorb and redirect energy on a scale that made them the most effective shields in the galaxy. The Veilithari capital ships fired on them with weapons that could crack open moons, and the Rithani took the hits and survived, their crystalline hulls drinking in the energy and glowing brighter and brighter until they blazed like small suns. And then the Rithani did something that no one in the Veilithari fleet had ever seen before. They redirected the absorbed energy back at the Veilithari in focused beams that struck with the combined force of every shot that had been fired at them. 3 Veilithari destroyers vanished in a flash of redirected fire, and for the first time in the battle, there was silence on the Veilithari communication channels, the silence of beings who have just encountered something completely outside their understanding. Phase 3, HFY said, and this was the human part. 40 human strike ships, small, fast, and crewed by the most experienced pilots in the Terran Defense Force, had been hiding behind the Rithani formation, invisible to sensors because the crystal ship's energy signatures drowned out everything else. Now they broke free and dove straight into the gaps that the Quilith swarm had created in the Veilithari screening line, heading for the command ships at the center of the formation with a speed and recklessness that would have horrified any military academy in the galaxy. Admiral Vorn saw them coming and recognized the tactic instantly. A targeted strike at command and control to create confusion and break the chain of command. But recognizing it and stopping it were 2 very different things. Pilots flew like nothing the Veilithari had ever encountered. They juked and weaved and barrel-rolled through fields of defensive fire, taking insane risks with a precision that came from generations of flight training that the galaxy had mocked as unnecessary. Commander Tanaka led the strike from the cockpit of her own ship, and she felt the old human instinct singing in her blood, the thing that had kept her species alive through ice ages and plagues and nuclear wars and the long dark centuries before they reached the stars, the stubborn, furious, beautiful refusal to accept that the fight was over. Her squadron hit the Veilithari command cruiser with a volley of torpedoes that shattered its forward shields and sent it spinning. And across the battlefield, the Veilithari formation began to lose cohesion as ships that had been following orders suddenly found themselves with no orders to follow. And then came the part that broke Admiral Vorn's spirit. From behind the Veilithari fleet, from the direction that was supposed to be safe, the direction that their formation had left unguarded because no enemy had ever attacked from behind in Veilithari tactical doctrine, a second wave of resistance ships appeared, led by Sergeant Mwangi, who had coordinated her arrival from 3 occupied systems, where simultaneous uprisings had forced the Veilithari to pull ships away from the confluence. "That is impossible," Vorn said, staring at her display. "You cannot coordinate an attack across 3 systems simultaneously. The communication delay alone." But the humans had not used the standard galactic communication network. They had used something much older and much harder to intercept. A system of predetermined signals and timed actions that humans called mission-type tactics, where every commander knew the overall plan and was trusted to execute their part without waiting for orders. It was a concept so alien to the Veilithari, who relied on strict hierarchical command, that Vorn could not even process it. The battle raged for 6 more hours, and it was brutal. The resistance took terrible losses. Entire squadrons were wiped out in seconds when they flew into concentrated fire. A Torvani support ship, carrying 300 medics, was destroyed by a Velithari dreadnought that did not care about the laws of war that no longer existed. And then came the moment that would be remembered for 1,000 years. A Rethani elder named Crystallis, a being so old that their crystal body had turned from clear to a deep luminous blue, saw a civilian evacuation convoy trying to escape the battlefield. A Velithari destroyer was bearing down on it, and there was nothing between the destroyer and the convoy except empty space. Crystallis turned their crystal ship and flew directly into the path of the destroyer's weapons, absorbing hit after hit after hit, until their ship blazed so bright that it outshone the nearest star. And then, when they could absorb no more, Crystallis released everything at once. The explosion shattered the Velithari destroyer and lit up the battlefield in a burst of blue-white light that was visible across the entire system. And when the light faded, the space where Crystallis had been was filled with 1,000,000 tiny crystal fragments that drifted through the void like glowing snow. The evacuation convoy escaped. When it was over, when the last Velithari ship had retreated and the Irani confluence belonged to the resistance, no one cheered. The cost had been too high for cheering. But across the galaxy, on every world where beings huddled in fear and watched their screens for any sign of hope, the news spread like fire. The Velithari had been beaten, not destroyed, not even seriously weakened, but beaten. They had attacked, and they had been forced to retreat, and that meant that the thing everyone had been afraid to believe was actually true. They could be stopped. Emperor Zhur received the news in his throne room, and felt something he had not felt in a very long time: uncertainty. He had expected the war to be over in weeks, and instead it was growing, and the humans, those tiny, insignificant, ridiculous humans, were at the center of it. He made a decision that would define the rest of the war. "Deploy the God's fire," he said to his admirals. "If we cannot rule a galaxy that defies us, we will burn enough of it to make the rest compliant." The God's fire was a weapon from the deepest archives of the Epoch Wars, a device capable of cracking a planet's core and rendering it uninhabitable in minutes. And the Velithari had kept one hidden for 9 centuries, waiting for the day it might be needed. That day had come, and on the bridge of his battered flagship, Admiral Achebe received the intelligence report about God's fire, and felt the weight of it settle onto his shoulders like a mountain. Ambassador Osei found him staring at the report in silence, and asked if what they were doing was worth the cost. Achebe was quiet for a long time. 900 years of peace, he said finally, and it only took one shot to end it. That means peace was never something they had, it was something they were allowed. We are going to make sure that when this is over, peace is something they own. Something that belongs to them, that no one can take away with a single shot ever again. He looked at her with tired eyes that still burned with something unbreakable. "Yes," he said, "it is worth it." The assault on Velithar Prime was not a plan that any sane military commander would have approved. And Admiral Jonah Achebe knew this, because he was a sane military commander who had approved it anyway. Intelligence confirmed that the God's Fire weapon was stationed in a massive orbital platform above the Velithari homeworld. And it was being charged to fire on 3 worlds simultaneously: the Rithani Crystal homeworld, the Quileth primary hive, and the Torvani garden planet. 3 strikes that would kill billions and shatter the Resistance's will to fight. They had 4 days. "We cannot win a straight fight against the Velithari home fleet," Achebe told his commanders in a briefing that felt more like a funeral. "They have 8,000 ships in their home system alone, and we have 1,400. The mathematics of this are very clear. If we try to fight them ship to ship, we will be destroyed. He paused and looked around the room at the faces of beings from a dozen species, humans and aliens who had been strangers weeks ago, and were now bound together by something stronger than friendship. So we will not fight them ship to ship, he said. We do not need to destroy their fleet. We need to destroy one platform. Everything is about getting a strike team onto God's fire and turning it into scrap. The fleet battle is a distraction, and every one of us in that battle is buying time with our lives so that the strike team can do their job. The room was very quiet. I will not pretend this is anything other than what it is, Achebe continued. Many of us will not come home. But if the strike team succeeds, the galaxy comes home. Every world, every species, every child who will grow up free because we chose to be here today. Sergeant Daramwangi would lead the strike team, a mixed unit of 20 soldiers, human and alien, selected for their skills and their willingness to walk into almost certain death with their eyes open. Among them was Sorath, the young Rethani whose crystal body now glowed with a fierce golden light that never dimmed. The same Rethani who had been unable to even look at a weapon simulation just weeks ago under Commander Tanaka's training. Sorath had changed in ways that went beyond learning how to fight. They had found something inside themselves that their peaceful civilization had buried for 900 years. Not the desire for violence, but the willingness to face it. "Are you afraid?" Wangi asked Sorath as they prepared for the mission. "Yes," Sorath said, and their crystal voice rang like a bell. "But I have learned from you that courage is not the absence of fear. It is the decision that something else matters more." Mwangi looked at the young alien and felt something warm and painful in her chest, because that was exactly what she had been taught by her own mother back on Earth. And hearing it from a being made of living crystal on the eve of an impossible battle made it feel like the most important truth in the universe. In ways that changed the world, he thought about the fact that the galaxy would remember this day regardless of whether they succeeded, and he hoped they would remember it well. They dropped out of hyperspace into the Velithari home system, and the sight that greeted them was enough to make even the bravest soul hesitate. 8,000 Velithari warships hung in space around Velithar Prime like a wall of dark metal, and behind them the God's Fire platform glowed with a sickly orange light that pulsed like a heartbeat, charging, building toward the moment when it would fire and 3 worlds would die. "All ships," Achebe said into the fleet-wide channel, and his voice was calm, impossibly, beautifully calm. "Begin the attack." The battle that followed was the largest in galactic history, and it was also the most terrible. The Quilleth swarms hit first, pouring into the Velithari formation in waves that crashed against the enemy like the tide against a cliff, not trying to break through, but trying to overwhelm, to confuse, to create enough chaos that the Velithari could not focus their fire. Velithari ships exploded under the swarm assault, but for every one that fell, 5 Quilleth ships were destroyed in return. The hive mind felt every death as a wound in its collective consciousness, and it kept fighting anyway. The Rethani crystal ships moved into position as shields, absorbing the fire from the largest Velithari weapons, and buying time for the smaller ships behind them. Rethani after Rethani blazed with absorbed energy and shattered when they could hold no more, filling the space around them with clouds of glowing crystal fragments that were both beautiful and heartbreaking. Human frigatures darted through the chaos with a desperate skill that had become their signature, striking at weak points and command ships and ammunition stores with a precision that no other species could match, not because humans were better, but because humans had spent 10,000 years learning exactly where to hit something to make it break. And in the middle of all of it, Admiral Achebe's flagship pushed deeper and deeper into the Velithari formation, drawing fire away from the rest of the fleet and toward himself. He was the bait. Emperor Zur, watching from his command throne on the surface of Valithar Prime, recognized the old admiral's ship and ordered his fleet to destroy it. Not because it was a military necessity, but because he wanted. Achebe, dead, wanted to make an example of the human who had dared to teach the galaxy how to fight. The Remembrance took hit after hit. Shields failed, hull breaches opened, fires spread through corridors where human and alien crew fought side by side to keep the ship alive. "Admiral, we need to withdraw," his executive officer shouted over the sound of explosions. "Not yet," Achebe said, watching his tactical display with the focus of a man who was exactly where he needed to be. The strike team is not in position yet. On the other side of the battle, Wangi's strike shuttle was threading through the chaos like a needle through a hurricane. They had lost 4 of their 20 team members before they even reached the God's Fire platform. Casualties of the intense crossfire that filled every cubic meter of space around Valithar Prime. And the remaining 16 pressed on with the grim determination of people who know that turning back is not a choice that exists. They breached the platform through a maintenance hatch on its underside, a vulnerability that human intelligence analysts had identified by studying the construction patterns of Epoch War-era weapons platforms and guessing that the Valithari had not updated the basic design. They were right. Inside the platform, the strike team fought through corridors swarming with Valithari soldiers who defended their superweapon with the fury of a cornered empire. And Wangi led from the front, firing and moving and shouting orders in a voice that carried over the noise of combat like a trumpet over a storm. They reached the core of God's Fire, a massive chamber filled with the pulsing orange light of a weapon that was minutes away from firing. And Mwangi's demolition expert, a human engineer named Chen, began setting the charges that would destroy it. And then Chen looked up from his work, with a face that Mwangi had seen before on people who were about to deliver very bad news. "The Valithari installed a deadman failsafe," he said. "If the charges detonate without someone manually overriding the safety lockout from inside this room, the weapon fires automatically before it is destroyed. Someone has to stay and trigger the override at the same time as the detonation. Someone had to stay behind." The room went silent, except for the hum of the weapon and the distant sounds of battle. Mwangi looked at her team and opened her mouth to volunteer, because that was who she was, and that was what leaders did. But before she could speak, Sorath stepped forward. The young Rethani's crystal body was cracked and chipped from the fighting, but the golden light inside burned brighter than Mwangi had ever seen it, brighter than any Rethani she had ever known. "No," Mwangi said. "Yes," Sorath replied, and there was no fear in that crystal voice, only certainty. "You taught us why to fight. You taught my people how to stand between the ones we love and the ones who would hurt them. Let me show you that we learned." Mwangi felt tears burning in her eyes, and she wanted to argue, wanted to pull rank, wanted to do anything other than accept what was happening. But she looked into the golden light of Sorath's crystal eyes, and she saw something that she recognized, because she had seen it in the mirror every day since Helianthus Prime. She saw someone who had found the thing worth dying for. "Make it count," Mwangi whispered. "I will," Sorath said. The strike team retreated, and behind them, Sorath placed their crystal hands on the override controls and began to glow, not just golden now, but white, pure white like a star being born. On the bridge of the Remembrance, Achebe saw the flash on his sensors, a bloom of white light erupting from the God's Fire platform, and he knew. The platform came apart in an explosion that outshone the star it orbited, and the shockwaves sent ships from both sides tumbling through space like leaves, in a wind. And for one perfect, terrible, beautiful moment, there was a new sun in the Valithari sky. God's Fire was gone, and with it, the last hope of the Velithari Empire. The battle did not end instantly. Wars never do. But the heart went out of the Velithari fleet as news of Godspire's destruction spread. Admiral Vorn ordered a retreat that became a rout, and on the surface of Velithar Prime, Emperor Zhur's own generals walked into his throne room and told him that the war was over. He raged and threatened and commanded, but they were done. Done with a war they could not win against an enemy that should have been impossible. Done with an emperor who had gambled everything and lost. Achibi did not see the surrender. The TSS Remembrance, battered beyond any hope of repair, went dark 16 minutes after Godspire's destruction. And when rescue teams finally cut through the wreckage to reach the bridge, they found the old admiral at his command chair with his eyes closed and a small, peaceful expression on his face. He had lived long enough to know that the strike team had succeeded, and that had been enough. The war ended not with a grand ceremony, but with 1,000,000 small surrenders across 1,000 systems, as the Velithari military laid down weapons it had never truly known how to use, and the galaxy began the long, hard work of rebuilding. But this time, the rebuilding was different. The new treaty was not called the Luminara Pact. That name belonged to a promise that had been made by species who did not understand what they were promising. Instead, it was called the Achibi Accord, and it was written by every species in the galaxy, working together for the first time, truly together, not as elders and children, but as equals who had bled together and buried their dead together, and earned the right to sit at the same table. The accord contained many provisions, but the one that mattered most was the one that humanity had insisted on, that every species would maintain a military, not for conquest, not for intimidation, but for readiness, because peace was not the absence of weapons, and security was not the absence of threats. Peace was the presence of the will and the ability to defend it, and that required strength as well as hope. Ambassador Lyra Osei, now the first human to serve as chair of the new Galactic Council, delivered the closing address at the signing ceremony on a rebuilt Helianthus Prime, standing in a new dome that had been designed by engineers from every species in the galaxy, and was stronger than anything that had come before. 900 years ago, she said, and her voice carried across the chamber and across the stars, this galaxy chose peace because it was tired of war. Today, we choose peace because we understand its price, and we will pay it every single day, so that no single shot can ever take it from us again. In the audience, Sergeant Daram Wangi stood in her dress uniform with a chest full of medals she did not care about, and scars she would carry forever. And beside her stood alien soldiers who had become her family, Quilif and Torvani and Rathani, whose crystal bodies glowed with the same golden light that Sorath had carried into the fire. Around her neck, Wangi wore a small pendant, a single crystal fragment that had been recovered from the wreckage of God's fire, glowing faintly with a light that would never go out. Across the galaxy, memorials were raised on every world, not just to the fallen, but to the idea that the smallest, youngest, most insignificant species in the galaxy had turned out to be the one that remembered what everyone else had forgotten. That strength and peace are not opposites, partners. That the will to defend what you love is not a flaw but a gift. And that peace, true peace, lasting peace, unbreakable peace, is not a gift given by the powerful to the weak. It is a victory, earned by the brave, and it must be won again and again and again.